Busan EFM. The English waves come in.
Everybody, welcome back to Wednesday night's special interview. The World Health Organization says that the Zika virus constitutes a worldwide public health emergency, citing a link between Zika and birth defects in babies born with small heads and underdeveloped brains. Well, the South Korean Health Authority says it will do all that it can to prevent the spread of the mosquito-borne pathogen reaching the country. So today we have got Professor Andrew Easton, a professor of virology at the University of Warwick. Professor, good evening.
Good evening.
Thank you very much for being with us this evening. If you would perhaps just introduce yourself a bit to the listening audience.
Sure. So I'm a virologist. I've studied virology and various types of viruses for a little over 30 years now. My focus of attention is primarily on viruses that infect the young, but it covers, over the years, it's covered a range of viruses. And more recently, I've been studying a virus which is transmitted by insects, enters the bloodstream. This particular virus is found mostly in around India, but it's a member of a family which is very, very commonly found in Brazil. So I have an interest in that region of the world.
You might have heard that Korea had a big scare last year with the MERS situation over here. So now that Zika has reared its head, a lot of people very worried about it. What is it exactly?
So Zika is a member of a family of viruses. We call them flaviviruses. It's quite a large family. It's got many members. And your listeners may be familiar, I suspect, with dengue virus, which is transmitted by mosquitoes and is a major problem in many parts of the world. It's a member of the same family of viruses. It causes slightly different disease. It is transmitted by mosquitoes. It's been identified in a number of different mosquitoes, but the most common mosquito is one called Aedes aegypti, which is found in urban areas, in cities and just on the edges of cities, because the insect is adapted to living with us. So it spreads the virus. The virus is transmitted by the mosquito when it bites, when the female insect takes a blood meal, and if it then feeds on another individual, it can pass the virus to them. Now, the disease that was recognized with Zika until recently was a relatively mild disease, which only occurred in about 20% of individuals who were infected. So the majority of people have no symptoms and are actually unaware that they have been infected, which of course presents a problem because they're a source of transmission, but they're unaware of it. The disease, as I say, is relatively mild. Fever, joint pains, headache, and similar sorts of symptoms, fairly mild, but very short-lived. And the virus usually grows in the body for a week to 10 days and then is removed. It disappears. But as we've been hearing in Brazil, there is an increase in this microcephaly in infants and in newborns, and there's some concern about what the link might be with the virus. There's no evidence that the virus directly causes this, but clearly the rise of Zika infections at the same time as the increase in appearance of another disorder does raise some concerns they may be linked.
Yeah, I understand that they also discovered quite a few cases of Zika in Venezuela as well.
Indeed, yes. So the Zika virus was first identified in 1947, in fact, a long time ago, in Uganda originally. It then circulated in Africa, particularly West Africa, for quite some time before it gradually started to spread to parts of Southeast Asia. Cambodia, for example, had some cases, and although the numbers were very small and it was very sporadic. It then entered some of the islands in the Western Pacific, ultimately French Polynesia, and from there it has moved into South America. It was first identified in Brazil early in 2015. And since its appearance in South America, it really has very rapidly spread through Brazil and all the neighboring countries. And at its current rate of movement, there's no sign of it reducing its rate of movement. It's likely to spread very widely over the American continent, and potentially, of course, then be transported from there to other parts of the world. But it will only become a major concern in parts of the world where the mosquito exists, because that's what transmits it between individuals.
You probably heard the news. I just caught it earlier today. Apparently, a person was infected with the Zika virus. I believe it was in Dallas, Texas, and they've determined that it was not through the bite of a mosquito, but apparently from sexual contact. That's
right. We've actually known about this potential route for quite a long time. The first case was back in 2008, also in America, in fact, where a scientist who was working in Senegal acquired the infection just immediately before returning home, and then transmitted the virus to his wife. And there has also been another case in Tahiti, in French Polynesia. So it's been recognized that there is this risk, but it is very, very small compared to the transmission of the virus by mosquitoes. It's really a relatively rare event compared to the rate of transmission in mosquitoes, to the extent that in French Polynesia, when there was an outbreak there which infected tens of thousands of individuals, there was only one or two cases of suspected sexual transmission. They were never actually ultimately proven directly, but there were reasons to suspect it may have been. So it's something that we need to be aware of, and people who are at risk need to be aware of this risk so they can take appropriate precautions. But as a route of transmission, it does not appear to be very common for this virus at all.
Professor Easton, if a person travels to one of the affected areas for business or for whatever purpose, and perhaps returns home and is feeling unwell, what type of symptoms should that person be looking for as far as Zika goes? Well,
unfortunately, they're very general and quite common symptoms of feeling just a bit under the weather, a bit ill, mildly ill. So it's usually an elevated temperature. You don't get all of the symptoms. You may only get a few, of course. So elevated temperature, headaches, sometimes joint pains, just generally not feeling well. It's relatively mild. It has not been recorded as developing into a major concern for the vast majority of people, unless there's some other underlying problem, of course. So if somebody has traveled to one of these risk areas, obviously they should take whatever precautions they can to reduce the likelihood of getting the virus. But if on their return they have general feelings of being unwell, then it would be good to seek some medical advice, get some tests done. The tests are relatively simple, straightforward. The virus, as I said earlier, circulates in the bloodstream, but it's actually cleared from the bloodstream pretty quickly, typically about 7 days, possibly up to about 10 days in some cases. So, and the disease itself, the symptoms only last, less than a week typically as well. So it's very transient, but nonetheless, you would want to seek some advice in case it's something else, of course, but also to take precautions to try and make sure that it doesn't spread from one individual to another.
Professor, the South Korean Health Authority just a few hours back issued a statement that it was going to do all it could to prevent the spread of this mosquito-borne pathogen from reaching the country. I'm very curious at a national level, or as far as what kind of protocols do countries typically put in place when they're faced with this type of threat?
Well, these are the sorts of things that we're all too familiar with, unfortunately, in areas where dengue is a major problem. So the only approach that we have to try and combat this at the moment is to reduce exposure to the insects, the mosquitoes. And that involves use of chemicals to try and kill the larvae of the mosquitoes. Social activities to try and remove standing water, stagnant water, and places where the mosquitoes can breed. And unfortunately, most of our cities have rather large numbers of those. But they can be reduced in number and treated with chemicals to kill the larvae that are present. And then it's largely advice to individuals what precautions to take to reduce the likely exposure to the mosquitoes by covering the skin, using repellents, and so on. So it's a very difficult situation. We've encountered this for decades with other viruses. There is reason to believe we can have some impact because, of course, malaria is spread in much the same way, and the incidence of malaria has been reduced significantly by these sorts of measures. So there is some expectation that with a good effort we can reduce the impact, but eliminating it or completely avoiding it would be very difficult indeed. It's a matter of control rather than elimination and avoidance.
Right. So people should not expect that at some point in time it'll be totally eradicated. Worst case,
probably not.
Worst case scenario. What is the fatality rate? Do they have a number on that?
It's absolutely tiny. The disease is so mild that it's almost below the level of recording for a mortality rate. It is very, very, very low, and it would only be likely in individuals who had other complications at the same time. So it does not represent, in that sense, a major concern. Of course, people are ill for a week or so, and that brings other consequences with it. It's not pleasant.
Right.
So it's more what we refer to as morbidity, just the associated illness rather than mortality, the associated deaths. That's the concern here.
All right. So if you have a well-functioning immune system and you are exposed, chances are you're going to go through some unpleasantness, but you'll get through it.
Well, you've got a 1 in 5 chance, roughly, of going through some unpleasantness. You've got 4 in 5 chances of not even knowing you've been infected. But if you do suffer the consequences, then they will be short-lived and bearable. Unpleasant, but bearable.
All right. Professor Easton, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us tonight. Are there any last comments that you would like to pass along, perhaps a piece of advice for some of our more worried listeners out there?
Well, indeed. Clearly, when a virus changes its behavior, as this one has done, it does cause concern for a number of reasons. But the evidence that we've got at the moment suggests that although it has changed its pattern because it's been introduced into a new country, its fundamental characteristics are not changing too much. So we do have a reasonable level of understanding of this virus and the likely level of threat that it poses.
All right. Thank you so much once again for being with us tonight, and you're doing fantastic work. The best of luck in all of your endeavors.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.